Welcome to Word Up. Is anyone here for the first time? Okay, welcome. We're so happy to have you here. My name is Rachel. I'm a volunteer here. For those who aren't familiar with our bookshop, we're a nonprofit, community-run, largely volunteer-run bookshop. Most of the people you'll see working here are volunteers. We're a multilingual space, so we have a lot of books in Spanish as well as English and some other languages as well. And beyond being a bookshop, we aim to just put on programming to support our community. We have a community fridge. We do author talks like we're doing today and all sorts of other programming. So we're so happy to have you here today. We have a calendars and information about membership at the desk if you're interested. But yeah, thank you so much for being here. I'm going to introduce our speakers tonight. So we're doing a book launch. Word Up is really happy to welcome author Kelley Kreitz to celebrate the launch of Printing Nueva York, Spanish language. Round of applause. Printing Nueva York, Spanish language print culture, media change, and democracy in the late 19th century, which uncovers the network of Spanish language writers and editors in 19th century New York, whose media innovations fueled anti-colonial struggles and democratic ideals. In conversation with Kreitz will be Orayoyan Noel, author of Invisible Movement, Nuyorican poetry from the 60s to slam. So I'm going to read some author bios real quick and then we'll get started. So Kelley Kreitz is a professor of English at Pace University in New York City. Her research brings together Latinx studies, media studies, and U.S. and Latin American literary studies, and has appeared in American Literary History, Atzlan, a journal of Chicano studies, English language notes, and Revista de Estudios Hispánicos, among other journals. She is the author of Printing Nueva York. She leads the digital mapping project C19LatinoNYC.org and serves on the advisory boards of the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project and New York City Digital Humanities. Orayoyan Noel is the author of 10 books, including the critical study Invisible Movement, Nuyorican Poetry from the 60s to Slam, winner of the LASA Latinx Studies Section Book Award, the poetry collection Transversal, which was named a Book of the Year by the New York Public Library.
And available for sale, Word Up.
Our register is open.
Buy this.
Yes. Buy everything. And the hybrid prose work Cuaderno de Isabella, which is forthcoming from La Impresora in Puerto Rico. Noel has published several translations of Latin American poetry and was recently awarded an NYSCA Support for Artists grant to complete Transfers, which is a translation of Winston Gonzalez's 2015 book, Translaciones, to be published by Ugly Duckling Press. A board member of the Latinx Project and editor-in-chief of its online publication, Intervenciones, Noel lives in the Bronx and teaches creative writing, translation, and Latinx studies at New York University. So yeah, I'm really happy to pass it over to Kelley and Orayoyan now. And I think we're going to start, Kelley, you're going to we're going to start with a bit of a reading and then move into conversation. Yeah. But thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
And I just want to say thank you so much to Word Up for inviting us here for this event. It just feels really appropriate to me to be starting off the launch of this book at an independent bookstore that is clearly anchored in the community and also a bilingual bookstore. So I'm just very honored to be here and really grateful for the invitation to be here. So I thought I would start off with a very brief reading. What I'm excited about is the conversation that we're going to have, with all of you as well. But I thought maybe I would just read a couple of pages to move us into the argument of the book and give you a bit of an overview of what this is about. And then we can get into talking about it. Printing Nueva York uncovers the leading role played by U.S.-based writers and editors of Latin American descent in the media innovation of the late 19th century. Visionary writers and editors including Bolé Perraza, Teófilo Domínguez, Sotero Figueroa, José Martí, Néstor Ponce de León, Amalia Puga de Losada, Rafael Serra, and María de la Torriente saw the changing world of print as a means of achieving independence from Spain for Cuba and Puerto Rico, while empowering the hemispheric community that Martí named Nuestra America to participate in the spread of Latin American ideas and culture throughout the hemisphere and beyond. At the very moment when Anglophone daily newspapers drew a stark line between producers and consumers in the forms of mass entertainment that they developed, the network of Hispanophone writers and editors in what I am calling 19th century Nueva York emphasized quality over quantity, collective mobilization over private edification or mass entertainment, and most importantly and experimentally for the time, reader participation over passive consumption. Their ideas helped to situate 19th century US-based Spanish language publishing in relation to the emergence of mass media. In that context, they contribute to recent interest in 19th century Latinx writing by locating US-based Spanish language publishing within a story that has long been dominated by English language newspapers and magazines. Reanimating the period's US-based Spanish language innovations in the late 19th century also introduces fresh perspectives on contemporaneous Anglophone journalistic and literary communities. Forward-thinking writers and editors, including Joseph Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst, Nellie Bly, William Dean Howells, and Henry James, explored the possibilities of a print culture that had not yet drawn the lines that would later solidify between writer and reader, producer and consumer, mass and high culture. In addition, the ideas about the future of news and literature that I recover here reveal the limits of print, especially for those whose stories the widest circulating Anglophone publications and many Hispanophone publications as well refuse to tell. To circulate their stories, BIPOC, women, and anarchist writers and editors also created their own publications. These included Minerva, a Havana-based magazine by and for Afro-Cuban women that circulated in Cuba and also among Afro-Cuban and African-American women in Tampa, Key West, and New York City. Teofilo Dominguez's collection of biographical essays, Figuras y Figuritas, which documented the contributions of Afro-Cuban leaders of the Cuban separatist movement, and newspapers of the radical labor press, like the New York-based El Despertar. These texts that are rarely considered in a literary context are the fragments that enable scholars today to piece together another story of the transformation of print culture in the age of electricity, one that locates ideas in motion rather than endpoints reached by the most successful of the period's ideas, experiments, and literary forms. Many of the ideas and ambitions that printing Nueva York will uncover may be unfamiliar or seem inchoate or unintentional compared to those that achieved long-lasting success, which have the teleological advantage of looking as if they had been better planned. The emergent, imperfectly realized visions and forms of writing that are the primary object of study in this book require attentive looking. Once seen for what they are, they provide new vistas on late 19th century print culture. Hispanophone print culture, focused through the lens of Nueva York, reveals more collaborative and collectivist models of print and media change at the end of the 19th century. They are unbounded by and often run counter to those of progressive, capitalist, emerging mass media of the period, even as both models claim to be fulfilling a democratic vision. Such models also demonstrate that, although local and national contexts shape technological infrastructure and media institutions, the work of cultural producers in imagining new uses for media technologies, or of what I think of as mediating change, operates within larger transnational spheres of circulation and exchange of ideas.
Thank you so much, Kelley. Good evening, everybody. It's so exciting to be in conversation with you. Before we get started, I just want to give a shout out again to Word Up. And I say this as a Bronxite, a former Washington Heights resident who knows how precious and how few these spaces are uptown, right? How rich our communities are in talent, right? In culture, and how few spaces there are, right? How invisible, right? Sometimes these communities are within the institution, and that very much connects for me with something that you're trying to do in this book, right? Is think about this energy that's in New York, right? That is that I think you tease out in utopian ways, which is a really beautiful part of this book. But that also is about who gets left out of existing institutional frameworks, of what mainstream newspapers were doing, of what hegemonic accounts of democracy were at the time. So I really think this is a perfect place to be having that conversation, because I see spaces like Word Up, right, as continuing that struggle, right, to contest and enrich and complicate, right, beyond a lettered city or beyond a set of received texts and histories. And I should add that as a poet myself and a translator, it's been such a welcoming space to experiment, to fail miserably, and a lot of that is based on volunteer labor. And I think in a lot of these spaces that you're examining, right, Kelley, I think there's a lot of just collective labor that's invisibilized, including labor by women, by Black people. And I think one of the things you're trying to do in this book is also think about how there is a collective dimension, right? There's almost a co-authorship, right? And I think sharing a book like this at Word Up versus at an academic event where we all imagine ourselves as, egg-headed specialists, right? Also involved in acknowledging the way in which knowledge is made collectively, right? And we depend on a lot of volunteer labor that isn't always named, right? To allow the sharing and this transformation to matter. So thank you for all that labor, and thank you for hosting us. Maybe a little bit of context also, I think, because Kelley, you and I have been in conversation also in and around New York and in and around attempts to just think about mapping in and beyond Latinx studies. So I wanted to give that context for folks. And that'll give you a sense also what I'm trying to do in my follow-up questions as well. But I thought I would get us started. Just you gave us that beautiful introduction, which gives us a sense of what you're doing in the book. Could you give us, a sense of what the book is about, kind of anything beyond what you just shared with us, and also what brought you to this book, given your trajectory as a researcher and as a teacher?
Sure. Well, I'll start with what the book is about. It's going to be hard to talk about what it's about without getting into the trajectory, but I think of it as the story that hasn't been told yet that needs to be told of Spanish language publishing in 19th century New York City. And of course, one of the reasons why I became aware of that story and its importance does have to do with being at Pace now for 11 years. And early on in my time at Pace and teaching some courses in Latinx studies, I just wanted to think about how to make the neighborhood around Pace, because I knew that there was the Spanish language history there alive, to bring that alive for the students. And so pretty early on, I started thinking about, okay, well, maybe if we could, because there are no markers, really, there's nothing that allows us to recognize that history that exists there today, in contrast to the giant statue of Benjamin Franklin that is right outside the building where now our offices are in the English department and the Dyson College of Arts and Sciences offices are. And I often think about that statue as sort of a symbol of all of the histories that get overshadowed, because he's such a figurehead for the Anglophone emerging mass press from the time. So it was starting with some mapping projects of working with students just to identify more of the printing presses and editorial offices that were in the neighborhood, that I really started to realize how big the publishing community was in New York City, and to conceptualize a project that honestly started originally much more hemispherically. When I was in grad school, I spent some time in Havana, and I had spent some time in the National Library there and fallen in love with this publication, La Habana Elegante, which it was really interesting being there. And I felt like I was having these parallel experiences of discovering the city in the present and then also discovering the city in the 19th century. But that publication, too, has a lot of dedication to New York City, of course, because there were many exiles who came from Cuba as part of the Cuban independence movement and ended up in New York City. So I just started to see, especially because of being here, how much there was this vibrant community that was using their access to print and their vantage point on the rest of Latin America, their ability to write more freely, to try to mobilize for Cuban and Puerto Rican independence, of course, also for greater recognition and circulation of Latin American print culture throughout the hemisphere. And so it just became this center, not the only one, I guess a node within a larger network of publishing. And I felt like I wanted to bring that story alive, both for its importance to the larger network, but also for its importance to publishing history in New York City.
Terrific, thank you. I wonder if you wanted to add anything else about kind of Park Row or that immediate neighborhood. I say this because I was mentioning that I was an adjunct at Pace many, many years ago before I'd done my PhD, when I was a clueless baby poet, right, wandering around the city. And, as an adjunct, you kind of just go from class to class and, scramble. And I typically didn't have time to like go to someplace nice, or nor the money, right? So I'd go to whatever hole in the wall I could find around Park Row. And there was something so beautiful but weird about it was such a migrant school, and there was a lot of commuter students, and students were always coming and going. And I remember just like thinking about these buildings. I'm like, everybody's coming and going. Look at these buildings that I've been here for so long. I wonder what histories they contain. Little did I know that we'd be here, right? And you would do some of that work of mapping those histories. So I wonder if you wanted to add anything just specifically on that area, right? And Newspaper Row, Park Row, right? And as its relationship to Pace and your time there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that is definitely something it's hard to not think about, right? Walking into that building, the 41 Park Row being the former New York Times building. And also I discovered during the research on the book that there was a Spanish language newspaper, La America Ilustrada, that rented space from the New York Times to be in that building in the 1870s. And so, the late 19th century, the period covered by the book, really was this period when Printing House Square, which is what it was called earlier, was gaining this identity as Newspaper Row, which was because of the newspapers that were beginning to locate there, the Anglophone newspapers. So there was also the New York Sun and the New York Tribune, the New York World by 1890 in a flashy building with a big gold dome on the top, which got knocked down for the entrance to the Brooklyn Bridge. But subsequently. So, there's such and again, this is where I think of Ben Franklin, right? There is such a towering history of the Anglophone mass press, but then so many important publications that were not only just in the neighborhood, but in this case, in the same building. And then I guess what I would also say is, this book is about the Spanish language press in that area, but it's important to remember that this was a very multilingual publishing center, and there were also Yiddish publications. I found out recently that there was an Arabic publishing community in that area. So I think that there is this kind of tension that I always think about in my research between this towering history of these publications, that some of which are still with us, and the power of the story of the emergent mass press and some of the myths of the biggest figures like William Randolph Hearst, versus the stories that we still need to tell about also the thriving 19th century black press that was in that neighborhood. And there was some overlap between the Anglophone black press and the Spanish language press, and some sharing of buildings and spaces there as well. So it's hard to separate. I remember early on I was publishing an article that turned into a chapter of this book, and a journal editor said to me, like, why are you so obsessed with putting all the addresses in this book? Like, why do you need to talk about the spaces? But I feel like I can't not talk about the spaces because there's so much a part of bringing the story alive.
That's so beautiful. That still blew my mind, the America Ilustrada, sharing that building. Picking up on that, I think one of the things that's really striking about this terrific and groundbreaking book is that it's also a mapping project, but in a very specific way. And of course, you actually offer us, right, a map, right? If you open the book, right, you get these, if I can show it here, these locations, right, that are in the book, right, with a little guide, right? And so in a way, you're bringing to life, right, those places. And it strikes me that you're also somebody who makes maps, right? Who makes digital maps, who teaches your students to make digital maps, and who collaborates with students on the making of digital maps. And so I'm curious about how your work in mapping also informed the way you approach this, these figures, right, and these texts that you're analyzing. Partly because we joke about this, but folks who are not in academia, particularly literary academia, might not know this, but there's a really annoying thing where literary scholars will say, in this essay, I map. And there's no map anywhere. There's not even any discussion of space. And knowing the absent-minded professors, I've been that person, and I've gotten confused with Google Maps, like, where am I again, right? So I would not always trust, right, what the literature professor is mapping, if they even are mapping. So that mapping that is like a dead metaphor, right, in so much literature analysis, you actually are mapping, right? And in a way, you're having to reconcile these really, really delicate, poetic readings that you do with what's on the map and what's not on the map. And that leads to a very distinct kind of analysis that on the one hand has that weight and that beautiful materiality, right, of all these physical spaces, but that also is thinking about how those physical spaces become, right, imagined spaces, conceptual spaces, right, in writing and in community. So I wonder if you could talk about just your investment in mapping, independent of this book, and that could be in your research or in your teaching, and how it shaped what you think you're doing here.
Okay, good question, thank you. I think initially I don't think I knew this was a mapping project, and I really thought of mapping as a pedagogical approach more than a research approach initially. I mean, for kind of practical reasons. So for instance, just to go back to thinking about teaching an introductory Latinx literature course at Pace in a class taught in English where I wouldn't necessarily know who in the classroom would come in knowing Spanish or not, or being comfortable reading in Spanish or not. And wanting to bring that historical lens into the course. How do you do that when so much of the publishing was in Spanish and there haven't been that many translations of many of these texts? And so I started thinking of the map as a way to, assign some things that have been translated. One of my favorites is Francisco Gonzalo Pachín Marin's New York from Within. But then also to give students an opportunity to do some archival work and look at some of the locations. And so it's almost like a view into the archive to give the students a sense of what was there, what has not been acknowledged or recognized, to visually be able to see what was there, but also to maybe think about some questions that you could ask of the archive, even if you can always read the text, but for instance, when you discover that there is a Spanish language publication that was renting space from the New York Times, questions about what kinds of interactions there might have been, or questions about, why was the New York Times renting space? Why weren't they filling their space, right? Like, one thing I did discover, because I was trying to learn more about that particular history, and I went to the New York Public Library, which has the New York Times records, and I realized that company records are also a very deliberately curated story, and I couldn't find anything about La America Ilustrada, and why would they save that when that was part of the story of them not being big enough to fill their own space? And so anyway, you can start to have those kinds of questions or conversations with students if mapping becomes a way into thinking about the archive as both a way that we can recover history and a way that we can see what is not recoverable. Because the other thing is that mapping allows us to see the sites of publications that we don't still have. No matter what language you can read, you just can't access them because the archive is fragmented and incomplete. And so it's a way of kind of holding that and giving students a hands-on experience. I think the other thing I would say is that I care about mapping, but I don't care about maps, at least not as an end. And I think that's a frustrating thing in digital humanities sometimes. Sometimes it's necessary because you need to be able to show an end product. Maybe you need to be able to fundraise for an initiative, right? But also, I'm not really interested in shiny things, and that is true for literary genres, and it is also true for maps themselves. Maps should be messy. They should be places where people can come together and work and collect ideas and collect history, but they're a means to another end, and that end might be dipping into the archive more, or that end might be trying to engage some absences in the archive.
Thank you. And maybe just following up, do you think that the way you're thinking about mapping shaped your readings of the different texts and figures that you examine here?
I mean, I think to the extent that, as I started doing this and mapping did become part of what I was doing and I did begin to see it as a research tool, I think it also helped me just to conceptualize, like, what were these connections? Like, how were these publications circulating? And one of the things that's really interesting about the 19th century Spanish language publishing community at this time in the 19th century is that the community of Spanish speakers who would be reading these publications in New York City was relatively small. And the audience was really in mostly other cities, but throughout Latin America and in other locations. So they're kind of forging this audience that is not local. And then you can see in the history of New York City in the early decades of the 20th century, and I think this especially happens with La Prensa, you can see that change, and you can see the audience become local, because the population changes and there are so many more Spanish speakers, especially from Puerto Rico. And so, I think that mapping did become a way of sort of conceptualizing where these publications circulated and who they were trying to reach, and how that was very specific, what that looked like specifically in this time.
Great. Fascinating. I mean, I think as someone working on, contemporary Latinx social media, right, from the 90s to the present, I was struck by how much something like digital cultural studies, I'm going to call it that, as opposed to digital humanities. So I'm thinking of terms that you use like participation culture that I associate with the work of scholars of social media, right? Network theory is a very important one. And so I'm struck that you're reading what would seem to me a very old type, right? A print culture, right? A very old type of cultural production, but within a framework that lets you appreciate how dynamic it was and how it challenged what, through like social media theory, right? We now understand as a digital theory as distinctions between, say, the consumer and the producer, right? The creator and the reader, right? And so you really are arguing for almost like a participatory framework, right? To understand this print culture. And key to that is how you think about these writers and figures and their publications as part of a network, right? And I think that's a beautiful thing. We were having dinner before, and I was mentioning I want to teach that to my grad students because it's so helpful. Graduate students coming from more literary background who aren't historians and aren't used to engaging with the historical archive as a whole, right? Often ask themselves, where do I begin? Where do I end, right? And what I love is that you're almost mapping this network, right? And there's something very, I won't call it intimate, but there's something very, I think you're at peace with it being small, right? And then from that smallness, it just opens up and opens up and opens up. And I think the introduction and the afterword do a really good job of showing us how this network of people, right? And because they're a network, they're never fully self-contained. They're always connected to other people in a way that's always expanding outward, right? But it really, that strikes me as one of the really unique contributions of this book in a Latinx studies context, and more generally just to 19th century print culture, which is not my field, but what the greatest hits, I guess, that I am trained, right, to discuss. And I think a lot of conversations around utopian politics, around becoming, right, that I associate a lot with like social media over the past few decades? Is social media, right, merely a tool of hegemony, or is it opening up all these spaces for new modes of democracy, right? Not only are you asking those questions, you're keying us into how these figures were asking themselves those same questions and how they themselves had a participatory and network understanding of their own media practice. So I'm wondering if you could say something about networks and maybe about network theory and the very contemporary moment, right, as it may be inflected, what you're doing here.
Great, yeah. Well, a couple of things. One is that what you're describing, I think, really points to the way in which the book draws on comparative media studies and that idea that, it's almost intentional, being a bit anachronistic, to be able to take a concept from the present and look at how we can compare it to the past and compare moments of media change, right? And so I think that was one of the early realizations in putting the argument together, that what was happening was, in different ways, these writers were grappling with the possibilities of their media moment. And I mean, we can relate to that, right? I mean, we can relate to, and I think we've lived through stages of this. I don't know that we feel like we're in a very hopeful moment right now, but the idea that things are changing and new media are opening up new possibilities for building audiences and advocating for causes or ultimately building a more just world. And so being able to look back across moments of media change is something that I think really inspired me thinking about that through comparative media studies. And then I think the notion of the network is particularly interesting because, that feels like a very contemporary concept, but also the use of the word network to mean like a social group of people who are connected because of something that they have in common. It actually comes from the 19th century. It comes from this moment. And so I do think that it's a term that facilitates this comparison of media moments. And I was thinking something else that I just forgot, but we'll come back to it. But I know what I was thinking. It's helpful because when you're opening up the archive, you need a new way of thinking about it. And actually, one of your colleagues at NYU, I think about an article that Tom Ost wrote about collections versus canons. And, I think it's helpful to think that if we're, obviously the archive is incomplete, fragmented, especially when we're talking about this community, but still there is so much that hasn't been studied. Even if you just open up the Recovering the U.S. Hispanic Literary Heritage Project, their archive, or a good portion of it that's available through the Redex Hispanic American Newspapers database, there's so many publications in there that still haven't really been written about. It's a lot. And how do you start navigating the archive in a way that can be meaningful? I think you can't claim a kind of mastery like, is behind the claim of a canon, but you can start looking for patterns or pathways or networks, which is, I think, the concept or the kind of pattern that I was looking for in this book. And I think one of the things I tried to point out in the introduction is that, I don't think this is the story to replace the dominant Anglophone mass press story of 19th century print culture. I hope this is a model for looking for other pathways, not just in English or Spanish, but also, as I was mentioning earlier, in Yiddish or in Arabic or languages I wish I knew how to speak, but I don't. But I think it has to be a collaborative project to be able to, and even collaborative beyond the university, collaborative with students, collaborative with communities, to be able to encounter archives in this kind of way.
Beautiful. I'm going to have I want to make sure we have time for questions, so I want to ask maybe 3 more questions. Is that okay? Okay, cool. So I'm wondering, one of the things I was really struck by is how you engage the contributions of women and Black people, right? Afro-Latinos, Afro-Latin Americans, where I think that the terminology is a really interesting question for the time. But one thing I love about it is that you don't just include them, which is the very kind of tokenistic liberal model. Oh, by the way, this was a sausage fest, but there's some women here and there's like a couple of black people there, right? I think you think of their contributions as critical,
Yeah.
which I thought was fascinating because in a way, just again, doing that kind of comparative media work, I think of part of what you're doing here is you're mapping these like counter-public formations, right? So the Spanish language press was a counter-public to the hegemonic English language press, but then you have these women and these black people within the Spanish language press, right, critiquing the very counter-public press, and in a way that kind of constituted its horizon of possibility, right? That you can't understand the political contribution of this counter-public project if you don't understand the dissenting voices within, and that feels like a very healthy way to think about social movement politics and a lot of like the toxicity, of politics in the present day, right, where it seems like we just disagree and disagree and disagree, but a healthy way to think about disagreement as just part of what made this network so dynamic, right, is there were different constituencies and there were tensions within it, but working through those tensions was how, right, the political, right, and you could talk about this in terms of revolutionary politics if you want. I don't know if you want to touch on that part. How is this tied to kind of revolutionary politics in Cuba, and right, but also to just the whatever politics you see as becoming as a result of this print culture in the U.S. and beyond.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important things to recognize about the Spanish language press in the 19th century is that it was not monolithic. And it also preceded the period that I'm talking about here and reaches back to at least the 1820s. And what I am highlighting is what I think of as sort of the best, most hopeful, most anti-racist, democratic approaches from the period. And it meant that every publication was a kind of struggle, and I think this is also a way of thinking differently. If I was just saying that you need to think differently about what you're looking for in the archive, and maybe you'll find the metaphors that help make sense of something that is vast, if also incomplete. There's something parallel about needing to think about what you're looking for in the literary. So in other words, maybe it's not polished final literary forms or great authors. One of the challenges with writing about this community was not emphasizing Martí more than he already has been, as much as I did very much come to respect in many ways what he was seeking to do. But how do you make visible the collaborators, the people who carried his project forward? And here I would especially point to the publication Doctrina de Martí and Sotero Figueroa, Rafael Serra. How do you make that visible? And one way to do that is to start looking at editorial teams and thinking about editorship. Here I'm thinking about some of the work that Sarah Salter and Jim Casey have done in imprint cultural studies or periodical studies, to point out that we need new models of understanding editorship, especially when we're looking at multi-ethnic periodicals. And so when you do that, you start seeing the tension. So in a publication like La Revista Ilustrada de Nueva York, which was a very sort of elegant, illustrated magazine, you see Sotero Figueroa as an editor in that publication kind of pressing the project a little bit further, right, from his perspective as an Afro-Puerto Rican. And then you see him taking it up even more in Doctrina de Martí in collaboration with Serra. And so I kept looking for those tensions among editorial teams and among writers and publications. And this goes back to that idea, too, of being interested more in means rather than ends. We can think about that with maps, but we can also think about that with publications or genres of writing. These publications were all kind of virtual workshops, and this is a metaphor that I sort of identify and pick up on that runs through the book from the 1870s to the 1890s. People really thought that what they were doing, they really conceptualized, at least in part, this sort of collaboration that was happening through the publication. So it really was a work in progress in this very messy, but I think, in the best moments, inspiring kind of way.
Thank you. Maybe on that note, there's a strong utopian dimension to your book, right? And maybe utopian's a loaded word, but I guess I kept thinking of what I love about Walter Benjamin, right? Which is that sense of media isn't just something we passively consume.
Yes.
It's part of our becoming, right? And so there's Benjamin, there's McLuhan there also, right? But I think there's something very Benjaminian about your project, right? In the sense that you really are mapping something that can't be mapped, right? Because it's almost this potentiality, this virtuality, right? This energy that is that gets activated in your book. You do a lot with like the telegraph and the telephone and all the ways in which these writers are responding to in literary ways, but also very much in pragmatic ways as relates to their different platforms, right? These new technologies like the telegraph and the telephone, but also there's a sense to them that those new technologies come with a sense of reckoning. We have to become some new kind of subject, some new kind of writer, some new kind of collective entity, right? If we are going to respond to the massive changes, right, that we are witnessing. So I wonder if you could say more about that, particularly as relates to the present moment, right? I don't want to get into like AI conversations or, of course, the current political climate, but it seems like we sure have enough going on where we could think about a Benjaminian becoming. I just don't think we're there for many reasons. We're a little bit beaten down, right?
Yeah, we
So I wonder if you could. It does feel, and I thought maybe is it about your students? Because
A little.
I think about that a lot, right? In the social media book, I'm like, what did I learn, right, from my own work in social media that I want my students to know? So as I get more advanced in my career, I think I talk less to other scholars and more to my students. And I know pedagogy is very important to you. So I wonder if you could talk about just becoming, right, and the possibility, a sense of possibility that you trace in these writers and their texts and their figures and their projects, but also that runs through your book.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to recognize, I mean, in some ways, how beaten down those who were writing the publications in this book also must have felt. And, we haven't talked specifically about the Cuban and Puerto Rican independence movement, although it's been in the background of everything that we're speaking about here. But, what this community was organizing for was the third attempt for independence against Spain, as also they're watching the United States become more and more of an imperialist threat. Not that it was just a threat. We had evidence earlier in the century already, 1848 being one of our big moments, of what the United States was capable of doing and planning to do more of in Latin America. Also, these were writers, many of whom were writers of color in New York City at the end of the 19th century, very much seeing U.S. racism play out and worrying about how that would be exported to other parts of the hemisphere. So one thing I thought about a lot in the book as I was trying to find these moments of possibility and hopefulness is how much we need that right now. And I did think about my students a lot. I do feel like, I was writing this book, I wouldn't say during the pandemic. I would say it had a very big pause during the pandemic, but, in the aftermath of the pandemic and, more recently, and just seeing how discouraged so many of our students are and thinking about how, you could say that this book is too hopeful, but I also feel like being hopeful at a very challenging political moment is its own political choice. And I see this as a kind of radical hope. And I see, I wrote the book because I felt like the story needed to be told of Spanish language, and not the story, but a story at least needed to be started about Spanish language publishing in the 19th century in New York City. But I also increasingly, by the end of writing this book, felt like we need the stories and the way that these writers pressed on. Even as things became more difficult, even though you could argue that much of the project here failed or reached a dead end. I mean, we haven't talked about the U.S. intervention in Cuba in 1898, but I mean, certainly the Cuban and Puerto Rican independence movements did not reach the end that those who were advocating in this book were working towards. And I think you could also argue that the kind of just democracy that was being envisioned in these publications, especially, I would say, the most collaborative of them, the ones that most fully embodied this workshop model, like Doctrina de Martí, like to some degree the anarchist publication El Despertar, that vision, that we haven't seen that kind of democracy. We're going to need to keep working, and we're going to need to keep figuring out how the media landscape that we live in provides us with tools and with increasing challenges to be able to do that. So, I think it's also worth noting that many of the writers and editors who came to New York City did so not just because many were leaving Cuba and Puerto Rico, but also were leaving other parts of Latin America where there were authoritarian or emerging authoritarian regimes. They didn't have press freedom there either. And so a weird thing about the United States in this book is that it is both this just terrible threat and demonstration of the horrors of racism, and also it is so needed as a source of hope for the people in this who were doing the work in this book. And holding those things at the same time, seeing how they did that, seeing how they pressed on, I think that's something that we all need right now.
Wow. You're pretty much describing Martí's politics. I feel like that's always, I'm like, which one is it, Martí? Like, what are we feeling now?
Yes.
But it's, interesting because in that sense, it's almost like a politics of remediation. And I get it in the sense of like, in the media studies sense, but also as like a remedy politics. As a Puerto Rican, right, we're still colonized, right? So if I consider your book from a kind of Frantz Fanon anti-colonial Afro-pessimist perspective, what was the point, right? But I think what's cool about your book is almost in the process of fighting colonialism, we discovered all these new tools, right? And all these ways to relate to each other. There's this toolkit that we have, right? And we maybe haven't thought of this era as affording us these tools, right? And you're in a way asking us to go back to this moment and say, there's something really important happening, right? That, regardless of the fact that, their desired outcomes might not have come true, they built a kind of infrastructure, right, that can be really, really useful for us now, perhaps more than ever. So I wanted to thank you for letting us linger, right, with all that unfinished dimension of their projects. I wanted to make sure I wrapped it up, but I did have like just a brief almost note about translation, right, which you can feel free to gloss as you want, but I think you're so generous in your translations, right? I feel like when I read your book, I'm like, wow, I should be, every time I reference the non-English name, I should be putting the equivalent, right? You're so thoughtful about that, and I love that your translations at the same time don't feel didactic. They don't feel overly literal. I think you take actually liberties in some places to capture like the spirit, right, more than the word by word, right? I think often there's a care, right, in scholars doing more archivally rooted work to really stick as close as possible to the original text. And I kind of liked it that you were dreaming another way forward, right? I think there's still a lot of care and respect in how you're treating the work, but you're treating them as the Spanish as a blueprint.
Yeah.
Right. And in a way, the translation feels like part of that politics of the potential of the becoming. Right. You're not going to beat down, right, these texts, right, to give us some scholarly minutia, right, or close read them to death. You're going to let them kind of linger in their evocative power, right, and that involves sometimes not choosing the obvious direction, right? Opting for an approach to translation that leaves some stuff, a little bit wide open, right? And I wonder if you could talk about was that intentional? What was your journey in translation? And it really is, as a translator, it's an art, and it's not something that a lot of scholars think of until the end of the manuscript. But I really like that. I'm like, ooh, look what happened there. I wasn't expecting, but it works, right? So, yeah.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because I do feel like translation was one of the most challenging things for me in this book, as someone who doesn't work as a translator, right, but had to become one for this. I guess what I would say about this is the way maybe I thought about the translations extends to how I thought about writing about the publications as a whole, which was that for each one, there was this kind of hope expressed, sometimes cacophonously because of what we've talked about earlier, that, there were different voices. These were messy workshops where people were trying to figure out how to write the world they wanted to live in through these publications into existence. But what I tried to do with the close readings was to tap into the hope, the best of it, right, and to make it soar in the way that I was talking about it. And I think the translations kind of served that purpose as well. Like, what's going to make what these people did this for, right? And so often these publications, early on in the 1870s, it was still possible to sort of do an illustrated magazine and have a respectable business and make some money off of it. But by the time you get to the 1890s and the Cuban separatist press, these are publications that people are doing in off hours, at night after their day jobs, proofreading, by candlelight at the, in the late hours of the night. I mean, these were labors of love, and so, and really with little hope when we're talking about the Cuban separatist press of any money being made off it, any money that would be raised would be going to the Cuban cause. So I think the question, and translation was included in this, was what's going to make what fuels these people soar in the writing about these publications. And so that's what informs translation decisions.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I'm done with my questions. I said 3, but I did want to ask you to end with a story.
Okay.
And I'll mention why I think it's really important now more than ever, but always, right, for us as academics, right, to find other ways to let people into our work. And I really think in a lot of our communities, storytelling is that, right?
Yeah.
The abuelitas who don't know all the jargon that we work with, right, but they connect to the stories, right, that our work involves. And I think that's a great way to just get our work to circulate. And so much of this book is about circulation, right? And the urgency that we need to communicate something, and it needs to be engaging, right? So there's a tension between marketing and politics, right? But I'm wondering if you could share a story with us. Like, what's a story? It could be the story of one of the figures in the book, right? Maybe someone who didn't make it into the book. Like, could you tell us their story, or tell us a story that didn't make it, or a part of a story that's here but that you didn't get to tell fully in the book?
Yeah.
Just tell us a story. That's
Yeah,
we want to be entertained, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, a story that is partially in the book but I wish I knew more about is the story of the bookstore, Nestor Ponce de Leon's Spanish language bookstore that was at 40 and 42 Broadway and was the largest Spanish language bookstore in New York City at the time. So to bring it back to where our location, where we all are now, and thinking of this as a legacy of the community that we're talking about here. And when I was talking with NYU Press about the cover for the book, what I told them the concept needed to be, and I tried to find this in the archive, was I wanted to find a picture of the bookstore, or some representation of the bookstore, because it was a site where the editors who were working in that area, the writers and editors, they would go hang out. They would, buy other newspapers, buy books, but also it was a gathering place. And, we certainly know some of the biography of Nestor Ponce de Leon, who was an exile from Cuba, became a very well-known editor, publisher. 42 Broadway became, both his print shop and his publishing house and his bookstore. Before that, the bookstore was located around Union Square. It had a couple of other different locations. We also know that he went back to Cuba after 1898 and became the first director of the National Library there. But I think the best sense that we have of the way that people came together and collaborated is in what we can piece together about the editorial teams in the newspapers. But that bookstore has stories that I would love to find, right? And that bookstore is, if part of what this book is doing is trying to locate the spaces where people were able to organize, to fight back against racism and colonialism, imperialism, to create the world that they wanted to live in, which was partly in print, but partly through the spaces where they would create these publications and where they would gather and just, be colleagues, be friends, live their lives. That's a story that the closest I was able to get in the book is that Nestor Ponce de Leon wrote about his own library, and he had this story of, this was in I think a column that he did regularly for La Luz de Ilustrada de Nueva York, which is where Martí first published Nuestra America, right before it appeared in Mexico City as well, in Partido Liberal. And he writes about how his library can't look like other people's libraries because it had to be portable, because he had to move it from Cuba to New York. And so he's like, this is what my library has, but this is what it doesn't have, because it had to be this portable thing. Good thing, because he eventually moved back. But, that's my only sort of window into how he thought. And I would love to know more and find more accounts of, we can find catalogs of what he sold, but just what the space felt like and what the community was like there.
Wow. 4042 Broadway, that's got to be down the road, no?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I take students there all the time.
Wow.
We stand, it's like a corporate office building now, but we stand outside and we look at it. And there were some interesting connections there too, like the Hour magazine was there, which Charles Dana ran, and Martí published a few early articles there. It was in the same building. So again, like mapping, and it starts to raise these questions about.
We need to get some QR codes, if not plaques or something.
Yeah.
That'd be a cool project. No?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Should we leave it there, or do we open it up for questions? Or no? Let's give a hand then to Kelley. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the great questions.
Oh, of course. Yeah, and I'm glad to take questions from you all.
I have a question. You mentioned that the readership of a lot of these publications was quite small. Mm-hmm. And so was that because the population of immigrants from Cuba and Puerto Rico at that time were small, or was it more of a literacy question, or was it small in New York or and large in other areas? I'm just curious about the spread of these publications throughout the diaspora.
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, I think the question of literacy often comes up when in conversations about print culture and Spanish language print culture, and I think it really varied widely depending on where you were, and a lot of these publications circulated in cities and where there was higher literacy, and the circulation size. There are some like trade publications from the time that give you a sense of including some Spanish language publications, what the circulation size was. So I've been able to see that roughly, the biggest of these publications maybe had something like 4,000 readers. So very small compared to when you're thinking about the Anglophone mass press. By the time we got to the 1890s, the New York Journal and the New York World were occasionally pushing 1 million readers, or, and more like a couple 100,000 when we were talking about the 1880s. So small in circulation size, but also interestingly much larger in geographic reach. And so, and then it just becomes this question of, I think they weren't trying to reach the largest audience. They were trying to innovate in how you could shape an audience at all. And also, trying to use print in many cases for something other than profit entirely. Although sometimes, that was part of it as well. So yeah, the circulation, just kind of thinking about the size, I think it's interesting because it sort of begs the question of whether mass press becomes misleading, or it makes us look in the wrong places. Like, we think going big and understanding the story of the biggest publications, it's one way of dealing with the archival problem, because you can say, well, we're just, looking at what most people read. But there's something about the publications that maybe weren't trying to be that big that I think makes us this very interesting. Like in some ways, small, but following a particular network was the point.
So almost more like it almost sounds like you're talking about like the underground publications of the '60s in the East Village in New York. You know,
Well,
where
at
people
dinner,
were doing like really unique things, not for the purpose of circulation, but for the purpose of creativity and knowledge.
yes. Well, and at dinner we were talking, and Rayolan was saying, like, this feels like a very Gen X book in some ways. And I was like, well, yeah, like, I relate to these publications because I used to make zines in the 90s, and I kind of get what, you know, on some very just sort of surface level, these are the spaces I've always sought out in my life, right? Like where we are right now, and the way in which these publications also represent some desire to be in an independent space is interesting. But also, I will say that, you know, I'm not even sure that counterpublic, for example, is the right word for some of these publications, because I think some of them were still writing at a moment when they thought we could become the dominant form of media. We could become the dominant language for print culture in the Americas. And so
they came from the elites, a lot of them in their
Yeah.
home countries,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. Thank you.
Other questions for Kelley?
So I just, one very specific question and then one sort of general question. First question is, what cross street is the 42 Broadway
Oh.
building? Because at one point I was like, is that downtown or is that uptown?
It's farther south from Pace, but I don't remember what the cross.
So it's 40 Broadway, not
40 and
Oh, I thought
42.
42 would be like around the 42 would be around the corner,
Yeah,
right?
I'm
Is it
sorry.
no? 'Cause-
No, a lot of the addresses in the 19th century would be two numbers together.
Yeah.
So it was 40 and 42 Broadway.
yes.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
I thought, I
Sorry.
felt like, wow, they had a space
Yeah,
like that
no,
in
no,
Washington
yeah,
Heights?
yeah.
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 I totally know where it is now.
Yeah.
So that sort of clarifies for me, just thinking about like these people working at these presses and doing this work, and you know, late at night, and just thinking about how they're interacting with all the other stuff that was going on downtown. P.T. Barnum's Crazy Museum, and just the, you know, the havoc that was being wrought down in those spaces at the time. So I'm kind of wondering, were there schools that also for the children of these people that arose that were specifically Spanish speaking, or like how did they, besides their press, how did they find their culture, or entrench, or whatever you want to say?
Yeah. Yes, it's a good question and important, because something else we were talking about at dinner is, you know, however much these may have been shoestring publications and people who were sort of on the margins trying to push forward their vision of the world, they also had a level of privilege that others didn't have, you know, especially when we're thinking about women. There are certainly BIPOC writers in this book, but, you know, there were also other spaces where people needed to go to be able to have their ideas known or circulating, whether that was the lecture circuit, whether that was, you know, in people's homes having conversations. And so, I mean, I think by the end of this book, I kind of wrote myself out of print, thinking about the limits of print. And schools were another one of those spaces. So the most famous example is La Liga, which Rafael Serra created, which wasn't for children, was for workers. It was like a night school. Martí famously was one of the volunteers who taught there, and I believe it was Tuesday nights that they convened and met. And yeah, I mean, I don't know of any, I mean, there certainly were like the African Free School, and for the Anglophone Black population in that area in the 19th century, there were schools. I think, you know, the presses, because on Ann Street there were presses that were publishing in English and Spanish and Italian and French, and you know, there were, again, it was very multilingual. The presses were centered in Lower Manhattan, but you know, people boarded in Brooklyn, they boarded in other areas of the city. It's a good question about where the children went to school. I'm not really sure.
I mean, I guess certainly, like, if you were in the case of like, if you were at the Martí level, you would probably teach your kid French, right? And maybe they went to the French school. I don't know. Maybe there's, maybe there's records. I don't know that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there were Cuban elite families who were sending their children to like American boarding schools and that kind of thing. And so, right, I mean, maybe for those who had money to send their kids to school, they were looking for sort of elite school options.
And churches too. I'm just thinking about like the two big Catholic churches that were they all Catholic? Were they, were they, atheists? Were they like? That's just another question. It's just open. It's that thing where you're like, it's very, very local, and then it just starts to blossom out until these.
That's this book, basically. You're like, ooh, it's this network,
Yeah.
and then it just becomes beautifully sprawling and unmanageable.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking the only thing that I can speak to in terms of the question about churches is Felix Varela, who was a Catholic priest. And you can actually see that in the 5 Points neighborhood, that church there has a little plaque for him. I think most of his congregation was Irish, actually. But, I mean, and that is the other thing, is to remember that this community was small, right? And so there wouldn't necessarily have been a lot of institutions that were just dedicated to the Cuban or Puerto Rican families who would have been there because it was small, so they probably would have found other spaces to be able to participate in schools and other kinds of things.
Any other questions?
I love that question because one of the most moving things for me about looking through these old newspapers is the ads in the back.
Yeah.
So you can see all the doctors, the music teachers. It's just endlessly moving to see all of these, the restaurants. It's like I'm sometimes more interested in the ads than I am in the articles because it's such a testimony to this vibrant here, that was inhabited. And I meant to begin by saying thank you so much for your work. It's meant so much to me, and I'm really excited about this book. And happy Jose Martí's birthday, everybody.
I forgot to mention that. That's right.
Today is the natalicio de Martí.
I thought you did it on purpose.
Oh wow!
I think like 3 years ago I did an event here on the natalicio de Martí. So what better way could we possibly be celebrating than with the publication of your book? I had this experience in class last semester that I wanted to tell you about, where I'm teaching a class in translation, actually. And it's a Spanish language class. The students are all Spanish speakers, and many of them actually came from Latin America. Like about half the class probably came from Latin America in the last, 3 to 5 or 6 years. But many of them also grew up here. So we were talking about Spanish language publications here, and I said, well, when do you think the first Spanish language publication in what is now the United States was? Just throwing it out to a room full of 30 students who would all have a strong interest in this. And they really, really thought, and finally, like, one of the really top kids in the class was older, in his 30s, and, came from Mexico. He was like, the 1970s? And I was just
Raza power.
I was like, you guys, do you understand that you are the victims of this profound erasure? And that is a profound erasure in the service of exactly the kind of racism that we're seeing, putting people in concentration camps right now. And so that's why I think your mapping project is so important, because it's the here-ness. It's like on the street corner in this place. And yet somehow it fails to become, obviously someone who goes and looks for your map can see it, right?
Yeah.
But on the city streets, it just doesn't become visible, right?
Yeah.
You don't, you can walk down Front Street and never know that Martí had his offices there. You were saying we need QR codes, we need so my question is really, you've been working with the digital map for so long, which was the first thing I shared with my students when I got that answer. But do you know, have there been any reactions to that map where, there was this huge Nueva York exhibit at the New York Historical Society. There have been, certain attempts to recapture this sort of lost world. I took the Greenwood Cemetery Cuban Tombs tour that Lisandro Perez does sometimes. If you ever get a chance to take that tour, it's phenomenal. You get the keys and you go into these like marble tombs from the 19th century sugar barons that transplanted to New York, and it's unbelievable. But just making it visible at street level, like there's Broadway's called Juan Rodriguez in Washington Heights. They renamed it after the first inhabitant, the first non-indigenous inhabitant of Manhattan, who was Spanish speaking, right? So there are some attempts to like manifest this history in the present day landscape of the city. But do you know of others, perhaps inspired by your map?
I don't. I mean, I think that is a kind of question about, what could happen next. And I will mention, I think I want to invite my colleague Sid Ray to, we've been working on this Ground Beneath Our Feet project where we've been trying to figure out from the perspective of Pace University, what is our responsibility to making these histories more visible. And, we have had some conversations, for example, with our art gallery director, Sarah Cunningham, who has done some very interesting projects with using augmented reality. And, she was talking with an artist at one point about Collect Pond, and, was there some kind of AR sort of project making Collect Pond visible. And so we've had a lot of conversations at the university, and especially through this initiative that Sid and I and others have been involved with. It was funded by an NEH grant that got canceled last spring. I will also mention the Clemente Center and the Nueva York Chronicles, and, that being another project where...
Clemente board members.
That's right, yes. And, the Historias project and another mapping project, the Nueva York Chronicles. And I kind of like those sorts of projects where, it's about bringing the community together to talk about how we would recognize the history, because I think what I have seen from the conversations we've had at Pace is that it's not really as simple as just putting up another statue next to Ben Franklin, right? Like, who's going to be that statue? And if we're acknowledging, like we are with the archive, that we can't just have the canon, we're going to have all these different pathways, you quickly get into conversations about, well, can it be a screen? And does the screen change? And who determines what gets on the screen? Can it be students? Can it be student projects? But whose communities? And so I think the way to do it is not to, because for a while I did think about, like, do we just need to, get some historical plaques, which we could do. We could work through neighborhood or city historical commissions. But I actually think it's more like modeling these kinds of workshops, right? These collaborative projects, and seeing what comes of it. And maybe nothing is as permanent as that Ben Franklin statue, but maybe that's okay. But at the same time, like, it is real that there's, there should be something. It's a good question. And I also just want to thank you for your work too, which is, we have a great translator of Marti in the room here, so.
Thank you for your work. Thinking this maybe not a great men version of that history. So I love that your book gets us into these places and these communities, right? Including like women signing stuff anonymously, right? In a way that reinforces the power of a collectivity. So it would be great if it just weren't a statue of Marti for every statue of Franklin, right? But also thinking about all the nameless people and all the collectivities and all the collective stories, right? That are there. And which doesn't mean you can't include some individuals, but that feels like in the spirit of your work as well, right? So there's always a network behind these like supposed singularity of these figures.
Well, and ultimately it's this question, this is actually something I was talking about with students today. I'm teaching for the first time this Intro to Digital Humanities class. And once you start getting into questions about what we know and how we know it and who gets to decide and how we can do it better than we have in the past, it also turns into questions about the role of universities in that work. And it's not just changing how we research, but it's changing how we think about the role of the university. And then, of course, it's no accident that this kind of work, all of the digital humanities work that was being done, that was about decolonizing the archive, of course, was defunded by NEH in April. The entire Office of Digital Humanities was dissolved. Universities themselves, of course, are under attack right now. it's no accident that it's because these are platforms, right, for, again, making this world that, could have some resonance or be a legacy of the potentiality that we see in these publications.
That's why we need DIY, indie. Let's make some zines, right? Let's make some zines and let's buy some books in the most non-capitalist, collectivist, non-money-making, right, spirit of solidarity. Gracias,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
One more big hand for Kelley.
Thank you.
And gracias, word up.